Karen White stood by her large bay windows, gazing out at the meticulously manicured lawns of her suburban haven. Everything in her world was pristine, orderly, and exactly as it should be, or so she believed. Her home, nestled in the heart of an affluent, gated community, was an extension of herself. The clean lines of the white picket fences, the uniformity of the hedges, and the tasteful homes around her gave her a sense of control. In this sanctuary, nothing was out of place, and anything that deviated from her vision of perfection was promptly corrected. Karen took pride in her role as the head of the Homeowners Association HAA, a position she had held for 3 years. It gave her authority, and more importantly, it allowed her to shape the neighborhood in her image. The HOAA was her fortress, her means of enforcing the unspoken rules that maintained the community's purity. To Karen, purity meant cleanliness, order, and most importantly, the preservation of a certain type of resident, white, wealthy, and aligned with her ideals. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed a moving truck down the street. Another family had just bought the house next door, and to Karen's dismay, it was a Latino family. Her lips tightened as she watched the children run across the front lawn, excitedly chasing one another. She could already hear them laughing and playing, their noise disrupting the quiet peace of her perfect neighborhood. More of them, she muttered to herself, gripping the windowsill tightly. First the greens, now this. The property values will plummet if we keep letting just anyone move in. To Karen, these families were intruders. She didn't voice her objections openly, not yet. That wasn't her style. Instead, she sent subtle emails, had polite conversations, and enforced HOA rules with a passive-aggressive smile. She prided herself on always being polite, though her intentions were far from kind. She was the gatekeeper of her perfect world, and she would not let anyone, especially people of color, ruin it. At the latest HOA meeting, Karen had discussed the ongoing issue of property upkeep, indirectly pointing out that some of the new residents, specifically those of color, weren't meeting the community standards. She made sure her comments dripped with the perfect balance of concern and veiled superiority, so no one could accuse her of being overtly racist. After all, she wasn't racist, she just wanted to protect her investment, her community. We have a standard to uphold, she reminded the board, her voice sharp yet civil. If we let things slip now, the wrong people will get comfortable here, and before you know it, this place will be unrecognizable. The board members, mostly in agreement, nodded. But there was an undercurrent of unease in the room. Karen noticed it, but chose to ignore it. In her mind, she was the only one brave enough to say what everyone else was thinking. Back at home, Karen continued her rounds, ensuring every lawn was perfectly maintained and every house adhered to the HOA guidelines. But despite her best efforts, she could feel the cracks starting to form in her perfect world. New families were moving in, families that didn't quite fit her ideal picture, and she was losing control. Her sanctuary was being invaded. The grocery store was one of Karen's sanctuaries, a place where she could shop in peace, among the familiar faces of her privileged community. The aisles were well stocked, the produce fresh, and the atmosphere quiet, just as it should be. Karen's world, however, was about to shift in a way she hadn't anticipated. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. Karen, as usual, was inspecting the organic tomatoes, her critical eye scanning for imperfections. She had no interest in mingling with the other shoppers, they were merely background noise in her perfectly curated life. But as she reached for a ripe tomato, she noticed someone out of place. A black man. He stood further down the aisle, casually pushing a shopping cart. His presence was unsettling to her, immediate and visceral. Karen's heart quickened, though she didn't fully understand why. He was tall, confident, and seemed entirely too comfortable in this space, a space she considered exclusively hers. He didn't belong. Her thoughts raced, her mind conjuring up all the stereotypical fears and prejudices she had absorbed over the years. Was he dangerous? What was he doing in her neighborhood? She had never seen him before. He couldn't possibly live around here. Karen's grip tightened on the tomato. She felt the need to do something, to reassert control, to defend her space. Her mind flashed to the news reports she had seen about crime spreading into affluent neighborhoods. She wasn't paranoid, she told herself, just cautious. As she turned into the dairy aisle, she noticed him again. The man was coming toward her, pushing his cart casually, minding his own business. But Karen couldn't shake the sense of intrusion. He didn't belong here. Not in her grocery store, not in her community. Without thinking, Karen pivoted sharply, blocking his path. Her voice came out tight and clipped. "Excuse me," she said, her words laced with barely concealed hostility. "Can I help you with something?" The man, startled but calm, blinked at her. "No, I'm good," he replied evenly, his voice steady. Karen wasn't satisfied with his response. She folded her arms, her posture defensive, trying to project authority. "Do you live around here?" she pressed, her tone hardening. "I haven't seen you before." The man raised an eyebrow, his patience visibly thinning. "Why does that matter?" he asked, his voice still controlled but with an edge of irritation. Karen felt the heat rise in her chest, her face flushing with what she believed to be righteous anger. How dare he question her? She was just trying to protect her neighborhood, her community. It wasn't about race or so, she convinced herself. It was about order. It was about safety. She wasn't racist. "I know everyone in this area," Karen shot back, her voice rising slightly. "I've never seen you around before. It's not safe to have strangers loitering around." The man's expression shifted. His patience was wearing thin, but he remained calm. "I'm not loitering," he said firmly. "I'm shopping, just like everyone else." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. Her mind had already made up its narrative. This man was a threat. He was disrupting the peace she had so carefully curated. She needed to stop him. "I know your type," she snapped, her words sharp and loaded with unspoken accusation. "You think you can just come in here, into our neighborhood, and do whatever you want?" The man's eyes hardened, his calm demeanor slipping. He took a step closer, his voice firm but controlled. "My type," he repeated, his words biting. "What exactly do you mean by that?" For a moment, Karen was at a loss for words. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but now the truth of her prejudice hung in the air, undeniable. Before she could respond, a tap on her shoulder broke the tension. A young woman stood behind her, holding up her phone, the camera clearly recording the entire exchange. "Ma," and the woman said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you're being recorded." Karen's world spun. What she gasped, her voice shaking. She turned to face the young woman, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not harassing anyone," she said defensively, trying to regain control of the situation. But it was too late. The camera was on, the eyes of the grocery store were watching, and Karen's carefully constructed world was starting to crumble. "You're harassing this man," the young woman said, her tone unapologetic. "I've been watching the whole thing, and you're way out of line." Panic surged through Karen. Harassing? She wasn't harassing anyone. She was just protecting her community, doing what she thought was right. But now, with every second ticking by, she realized the narrative had slipped out of her hands. The man in front of her remained calm, his expression shifting from frustration to something that looked almost like pity. "You should leave," he said quietly, his words final. Karen's mouth moved, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of the other shopper's eyes on her, the quiet judgment suffocating. Her face flushed with embarrassment and fear as she realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Without another word, Karen turned and stormed out of the store, leaving her half-filled cart behind. The world she had tried so hard to control was slipping through her fingers, and for the first time, Karen realized just how powerless she truly was. The light from Karen White's phone flickered in the dark as she turned over in bed, her fingers itching to scroll through her social media feed. The notification pinged again. Karen hesitated, still groggy from the events of the day. The grocery store incident gnawed at her conscience, but she shrugged it off like an inconvenient fly. She wasn't wrong, was she? That man, Terrence Johnson, didn't belong there, at least not in her mind. She had been protecting her community, hadn't she? But the world was about to tell her otherwise. With a deep breath, she tapped the notification. Her heart dropped. There it was, the video, a 2-minute clip of her heated confrontation with Terrence in the grocery store, plastered all over social media. "Racist Karen attacks innocent black man," the caption read, bold and unapologetic. In the video, her face was contorted with anger, her words drenched with a superiority that now felt foreign to even her own ears. The comments below the post were vicious. "Another privileged Karen, thinking she owns the place. Disgusting. This is what racism looks like in broad daylight. She's everything that's wrong with this country." Her hands shook as she scrolled through the thousands of comments, shares, and reposts. The video was everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. News outlets were picking it up, local headlines calling her the face of white privilege. Her image, once pristine in the gated community, had now become a symbol of white entitlement, a term she had only heard whispered in distant political debates, but never imagined would be associated with her. For the first time, Karen felt the walls closing in. The neighbors she once called friends, people like Melissa Reed, who had always eagerly sought her approval for book clubs and social events, were no longer returning her calls. The local Hawaii chat that she once dominated was eerily quiet, and those who dared respond gave curt, indifferent replies. Melissa texted her Karen, "Maybe it's best if you don't come to the meeting this week." Karen stared at the text, her stomach twisting into a knot. She had always prided herself on her place in the neighborhood, a leader, an example to others. But now, everything felt precarious, slipping through her fingers. Her world, built on routine and status, was crumbling. The relentless buzzing of her phone yanked her back to the present. Another notification this time, from an old friend in college. "Karen, what happened to you?" "This isn't the girl I knew." She felt a sting in her chest, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She clicked the message away. Her thoughts spiraled, bouncing between anger, denial, and confusion. "I'm not racist," she whispered, almost trying to convince herself. "I was just protecting my community. I wasn't wrong, but the truth was harder to swallow with each passing second, the backlash too loud to ignore." Brad walked into the bedroom, phone in hand, his face a mask of tension. He glanced at Karen, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Have you seen it?" Karen asked, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond immediately, only nodded, eyes cold. "It's everywhere, Karen. People are calling. The Hoe is going to address it." You've really done it this time." There was no comfort in his voice, just cold distance, and it stung. Karen stared at him, desperate for some reassurance, but his silence was louder than any condemnation. He stood by the door, his body language rigid, distant, as if he couldn't wait to leave the room. For a brief moment she wanted to scream, to tell him that she had only done what she thought was right. But the words died in her throat, drowned out by the deafening roar of her public shaming. She reached for him, but Brad was already gone, retreating into his office. The house, once a fortress of comfort and security, now felt like a cage. Outside, Karen could hear the muffled voices of reporters gathering, their cameras poised for any movement. The internet had come for her, and it wasn't letting go. In the days following the viral video, Brad's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and Karen's attempts to reach out to him were met with cold indifference. His presence in the house was more of a ghostly shadow than a comforting companion. Each time she passed his closed office door, she felt a creeping dread settle in her bones, an anxiety she couldn't name. Late one evening, Karen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing with the fallout from her public scandal. Brad hadn't come to bed, again. She listened carefully, hearing the faint murmur of his voice from the other side of the house. He was on the phone, his words low and clipped, as though he didn't want to be overheard. Curiosity got the better of her. She slipped out of bed, her feet padding quietly across the carpet as she approached his office. The door was ajar, just enough for her to catch a glimpse of him. Brad stood by his desk, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was tense, his brow furrowed in a way she hadn't seen before. "What time is the meeting?" Brad asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not bringing anyone else. It's better if we keep this tight, no mistakes." Karen froze, her hand hovering just above the doorframe. "Meeting? What meeting?" Her mind raced with questions, but she couldn't bring herself to step in. Instead, she remained rooted to the spot, eavesdropping on a conversation that she was never meant to hear. "The others are in," Brad continued. "We need to move quickly, or we risk exposure." "No, they don't know. Nobody does." Karen's heart pounded in her chest. Who was he talking to? She had always known Brad to be secretive about his work, but this felt different, darker, more dangerous. As she pulled back from the door, her mind swirled with fragmented thoughts. What was Brad hiding? Why was he acting so distant, so secretive? Her instinct was to ask him, to confront him about the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the sudden disappearances. But every time she worked up the nerve to question him, his cold demeanor pushed her back into silence. In the days that followed, Brad became even more withdrawn. He was gone for long stretches, offering vague excuses about work and meetings. Karen didn't press him, not at first. She had her own crisis to manage: the relentless harassment from the media, the whispers from neighbors, the growing sense that her life was spiraling out of control. But the unease gnawed at her, persistent and unyielding. One evening, as she cleared out Brad's jacket from the coat rack, a small keycard slipped from the pocket. Karen frowned, holding it up to the light. It wasn't from his office, and it certainly didn't belong to anywhere she knew of. When she asked Brad about it later that night, his response was icy. "Drop it, Karen," he snapped, his tone sharp and final. Karen recoiled, startled by the venom in his voice. She had never seen him like this, so guarded, so hostile. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something else lurking beneath the surface: fear. The realization hit her like a cold splash of water. Brad was hiding something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Karen lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling once again, her mind racing with possibilities. She thought back to the keycard, the late-night phone calls, the mysterious meetings, pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet fit together. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. As the nights grew longer and Brad's absences more frequent, Karen's perfect suburban world began to crack at the seams. She had built her life on appearances, on being the ideal wife, the respected community leader. But now, with her public disgrace and Brad's increasingly mysterious behavior, that life was unraveling. And the worst part was, Karen couldn't stop it. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Karen White's pristine neighborhood. From her kitchen window, Karen could see the perfectly trimmed hedges and the freshly paved driveways of her neighbors. Everything looked exactly as it should: orderly, controlled, predictable. Karen loved it this way. She wiped her hands on a towel, breathing in the familiar smell of lemon cleaner that made her home feel spotless. But today, something felt off. Karen had been trying to ignore the nagging tension in the air ever since her altercation at the grocery store. The incident, her confrontation with a black man who didn't seem to belong in her neighborhood, had gone viral, painting her as the worst type of suburban racist. She tried to dismiss it, tried to rationalize her actions. But no matter how much she justified herself, the endless online comments, the judgmental stares of her neighbors, and even the awkward silences of her friends had started to get to her. Karen looked up from the sink when she heard a car door slam outside. It wasn't unusual. Her husband Brad often worked late, sometimes not coming home until after dark. But something about this felt different. There wasn't just one door slam, there were several. She peeked through the curtains, and her heart skipped a beat. Black SUVs were lining the street, their windows tinted and ominous. Men in tactical gear poured out of the vehicles, moving with swift precision, their faces serious, their movements sharp. For a second, Karen was frozen in place, her mind refusing to connect the dots. Then, they came for her house. FBI. Open up! The shout shattered the quiet evening, echoing through the stillness of the neighborhood. The pounding on the door was so loud it reverberated through Karen's body. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, trying to make sense of what was happening. Brad, she screamed, her voice breaking as panic set in. Brad, what is going on? Her husband appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale but composed in a way that made Karen's blood run cold. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he looked like a man who had been expecting this, waiting for this. Before Brad could speak, the door was kicked in, splintering under the force of the FBI agents. They flooded into the house, weapons drawn, their commands blending into a cacophony of orders. Down on the ground, hands behind your head. Karen screamed, her body paralyzed with terror. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Her perfect, controlled life was spiraling into chaos right before her eyes. One of the agents, a tall man with sharp eyes and a stern expression, grabbed Brad and threw him against the wall. Karen could see Brad's face twist in pain as they cuffed him, dragging him toward the door. What is this? She cried, her voice shrill. What are you doing? Another agent, this one a woman with short, dark hair, turned to Karen. Her voice was cold, emotionless. Your husband, Brad White, is under arrest for his involvement in a domestic terror cell. He's been organizing a large-scale attack on federal buildings. We have a warrant to search your house. Karen felt like the air had been knocked out of her. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. Domestic terror cell? Federal buildings? None of it made sense. Brad was a businessman, a financial consultant. He wasn't a terrorist. This must be a mistake, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. But it wasn't. As the agents ransacked her home, pulling out documents, computers, and weapons from Brad's office, Karen's world began to collapse. The media, already obsessed with her viral video, descended on the scene like vultures, filming everything: the shattered door, the agents carrying evidence, Brad being shoved into the back of an unmarked vehicle. Everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie. In the hours following the raid, Karen sat in a small, dimly lit room at the local FBI office. Her hands trembled in her lap, her mind unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The agents had taken Brad away, leaving her with more questions than answers. How could her husband, her Brad, be involved in something so horrific? She had trusted him. She had never asked questions, never doubted his long hours, his secretive work. Now her ignorance had caught up with her, and she was drowning in it. The door creaked open, and Karen looked up to see a tall, well-built man step inside. His face was familiar, painfully so. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as recognition dawned on her. It was the man from the grocery store. The man she had confronted, the man she had accused of not belonging in her neighborhood. Only now he wasn't just some stranger. He was wearing an FBI jacket. Karen's mouth went dry as he sat down across from her, his calm eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "Mrs. White," he said, his voice measured and professional. "I'm Special Agent Terrence Johnson." Karen's stomach churned. You're the man from the grocery store," she stammered. "The man I—" "Yes," Terrence interrupted, his expression unreadable. "The man you racially profiled." Karen flinched, her face flushing with shame. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that it wasn't what it seemed, that she was just being cautious. But the words died in her throat. There was nothing she could say that would erase what she had done. Terrence didn't let her off the hook. "You saw me, a black man, and immediately assumed I didn't belong in your community. You accused me of being dangerous, of being a threat, all because of the color of my skin." "I didn't know," Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Terrence said, his voice hardening. "You didn't know, but you didn't care to find out either." The silence between them was suffocating. Karen felt like the walls of the room were closing in on her, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume the worst. And now, the man she had wronged was the one sitting across from her, holding her fate in his hands. Terrence leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "For months we've been investigating your husband. Brad is a key player in a white nationalist terror group. We've been watching his movements, tracking his communications. The night you confronted me in the grocery store? I was there because I was tracking your husband." Karen's head spun. The man she had treated with such contempt, the man she had belittled and accused, had been working to stop a domestic terror attack. Her husband, the man she had trusted for years, was the real threat. And she had been too blind to see it. Terrence continued, his tone steady. "We've been building this case for months, and your husband is at the center of it. We knew he was planning something big, but we needed more evidence. That's why I was in your neighborhood that day, and instead of asking why I was there, instead of treating me like a human being, you accused me of not belonging." Karen's face burned with shame. She had been so wrong, so terribly, unforgivably wrong. Terrence stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow over her. "Mrs. White, your husband has been involved in some of the most dangerous, hate-fueled activities in this country, and the sad part is, you've been complicit in your silence. You chose not to see the signs, and now you're paying the price." As Terrence walked toward the door, Karen's voice cracked. "I didn't know," she said again, her voice hollow. "I didn't know." Terrence paused, looking back at her with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "That's the problem, Mrs. White. You never cared enough to find out." With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Karen alone with the shattered pieces of her once perfect life. The warm glow of Karen's immaculate kitchen seemed to mock her as she stared out the window. The streets outside were quiet, but she knew better. Behind the drawn curtains of her neighbors' homes, whispers were spreading like wildfire. The viral video of her confrontation with Terrence had blown her life apart. In the footage, she was seen as the embodiment of suburban racism, angry, defensive, ignorant. Her words had been dissected by millions online, strangers who had no qualms about labeling her a Karen and much worse. Her phone buzzed constantly, not with the friendly texts she once received, but with hateful messages. "How could you one read? I thought you were better than this," said another. Even Melissa, her closest friend, had stopped answering her calls. Karen's carefully curated world, built on appearances and social status, was crumbling before her eyes. The isolation became unbearable. The coffee mornings, book clubs, and social gatherings she had once dominated were now held without her. She could see them through the window groups of neighbors who no longer invited her. Her spotless house, once her pride, now felt like a cage. It wasn't just the public shame that was destroying her. Brad's arrest had unleashed a tidal wave of scrutiny from the FBI. Karen sat in her living room, trembling as agents searched every inch of her home. They combed through Brad's office, confiscating files, computers, and flash drives. Every thud of an agent's boot against her hardwood floors was a reminder that her life would never be the same. She had known Brad was secretive, but she never imagined he could be involved in something so monstrous. A terrorist, she whispered to herself in disbelief, unable to comprehend it. But the evidence was overwhelming. As the FBI uncovered more about Brad's activities, they began to suspect that Karen, too, had a role to play. Her proximity to Brad made her an inevitable target. She tried to explain to them that she didn't know, that she was innocent. But her ignorance, in the eyes of the FBI, was not a defense, it was complicity. She was questioned relentlessly, the agents' voices probing every aspect of her life, and doubt gnawed at her insides. One agent had been particularly cold. "How could you not have known? A wife knows her husband's life," he said, his tone sharp with accusation. "Ignorance won't save you." The words clung to her, suffocating her. What? How could she have been so blind? Days passed, and Karen was called back to the FBI office. This time, it wasn't the usual barrage of questions from faceless agents. She was ushered into a small, windowless room, where Terrence Johnson sat calmly, his FBI badge clipped to his dark suit. The same man she had once berated for simply existing in her grocery store. The same man whose patience she had tested with her prejudice. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she sat across from him. Terrence was composed, unflinching, as if the weight of what she had done didn't affect him. But it did. She could feel it. "Do you know why you're here?" Terrence asked, his voice calm but firm. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I didn't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know about Brad, about any of it." Terrence's eyes flickered with something, disappointment, perhaps, or frustration. "Didn't know," he repeated, leaning forward slightly, "or didn't want to know." The question hung in the air like a blade. Karen felt her defenses crumbling. Terrence wasn't shouting at her, he wasn't even angry, but the calm in his voice made his words hit even harder. "You judged me without knowing me," Terrence said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You saw my skin, and you assumed. And all the while, your own husband was involved in something far worse than anything you could have imagined." Karen's breath caught in her throat. The irony of the situation was suffocating. She had been so consumed by her own prejudices, by her need to protect the purity of her neighborhood, that she had missed the real danger lying next to her in bed every night. "Your ignorance," Terrence continued, "is what blinded you. You were so focused on keeping people like me out of your world, you didn't see the danger in your own home. You didn't see the hate that was growing right beside you." The weight of his words crushed her. For the first time, Karen felt the full force of her actions. She had been wrong, so wrong, and now, there was no going back. Karen sat alone in her kitchen, staring at her phone. She had tried calling Melissa again, but there was no answer. It had been days since they last spoke. Desperate for some kind of support, she decided to visit her friend's house. Maybe, in person, things would be different. She walked the short distance to Melissa's front door, her heart heavy with dread. When Melissa answered, her smile was strained, her body language tense. Karen could feel the distance between them. "Melissa," Karen began, her voice shaky. "I know things have been difficult, but we've been friends for years. I need you." Melissa's face hardened. "Karen, this isn't about our friendship," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "You've put us all in a difficult position. The video, Brad, the FBI, it's too much. People are talking, they think you're a part of it." Karen recoiled, stunned by the coldness in Melissa's words. "But I didn't know any of it." Melissa sighed, crossing her arms. "Maybe you didn't. But people are nervous now. We don't need this kind of attention in our neighborhood." Karen stared at her, the betrayal sinking in. "Is that what this is about? You're worried about how it looks? About keeping everything perfect, like we always have?" Melissa didn't respond, her silence damning. "I thought you were my friend," Karen whispered. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice dropping. "Look, Karen, we've all worked hard to keep this neighborhood safe. Some people just don't belong here. Maybe it's time we weed out the ones who don't fit." Karen's breath caught. The thinly veiled racism in Melissa's words was impossible to ignore. Melissa wasn't just abandoning her as a friend, she was revealing who she really was, the same ugly prejudice Karen had clung to for so long. But now, it disgusted her. Without another word, Karen turned and walked away, feeling more alone than ever. As Karen's world crumbled, the FBI investigation grew larger, exposing more members of the white nationalist cell Brad had been a part of. News reports began detailing the extent of the group's activities, targeting minorities, planning attacks, and spreading hate. The deeper the FBI dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about Brad. This was part of a nationwide movement, one that had infiltrated suburban communities across the country. Terrence Johnson became a key figure in the investigation, not just because of his role in bringing down the terror cell, but because of his resilience in the face of racism. His calm, steady demeanor during the interrogation of Karen, his ability to rise above her prejudices, made him a symbol of justice in a world still plagued by racial hatred. As Karen watched the news from the isolation of her home, she couldn't help but feel the bitter irony. The very system of racial privilege she had once upheld was now being dismantled, piece by piece. And her downfall was part of that destruction. The FBI, under increasing public pressure, was cracking down on white nationalist groups across the country, and Karen's ignorance had played a part in exposing the very thing she had unwittingly protected. In the end, Terrence stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that justice was possible, even in a world still mired in prejudice, and Karen, once so certain of her place in the world, was left to reckon with the consequences of her blindness and her complicity. Her life would never be the same.